All right. So the other sessions in the school garden workshop are also recorded, so you'll be able to view those. And if you don't want your face in the recording, totally understand. Feel free to turn your camera off. And you'll also have this slide deck. We will mail this to you, so you'll have this resource. And so our speakers today are Hope Guardenier, the Executive Director of School Sprouts, and Eliza Lawrence, who is the School Garden Coordinator for the Regional Environmental Council. And I'm going to pass this to them. And so you all can tell me, Hope and Eliza, you can tell me when to move the slide deck.
Okay, great. So I'm going to kick this off and then pass it to Eliza, who's going to continue with some of the student buy-in piece. But I feel, and I have to apologize, there's a piano lesson happening in the other room, so you might hear like the tickling of the ivories.
It was kind of pretty, Hope. I thought it was kind of
good. It's like background. So when I come into a garden program new, or when I arrive into a garden like I did this morning and at the Jackson Street School in Northampton, there are a number of things kind of in place in the space that help to ensure student safety and engagement. And so I'm going to talk about some of the structure that I build and some of the infrastructure that I use in order to create a safer, more engaging space for students within the garden. And so one of them has to do with like the actual tools that we're using. And some of it has to do with how I'm moving the students around the garden space and how I'm preparing them to actually use the tools. And then part of it is how engaged the students are in the activity and what I do to try and help with that, to help get them to really buy into the work that they're doing. When we like start off in the garden, I will generally divide them up into groups, and that can happen in a number of different ways. If we're sitting at picnic tables, it might be just by picnic table. I will generally work with a teacher, so the teachers are out there with me in the garden, which I always think kind of explain the work that I do as kind of being like a special, except I'm like the art teacher, but instead of an art room, I have a garden and I'm the garden teacher. The difference is that in most specials in schools, the special happens during teacher prep. So the teachers don't come to the art room, right? But they do come to the garden with me. The idea with that is that then they get to take what the students are doing in the garden back into their classroom and use it in their own curriculum. But so having the teacher there, the classroom teacher there, and if you're a classroom teacher, having you there as the garden teacher is a really important aspect of managing kids. I think we all know that students, when they have a sub, they tend to be a little bit more outside the box about their behavior, and it can create unsafe spaces for everybody. So that's like just one piece of my programming that kind of helps to set that tone. The way that I divide them up, either by counting off or by putting them into groups by table, I'll generally like check with the teacher because they know the students better than I do. And so if there are kids who shouldn't be in a group together because it's going to create an unsafe situation, then they will say, actually, so-and-so is going to be a 1 instead of a 2. And I don't need any more information about that. I just know that they're dividing kids up based on what they already know about the students. When we divide up, I'm thinking about the job that they're doing and how many kids can be doing it at the same time. So if we're weeding the garden paths, the entire class of 20 to 25 students can be weeding garden paths. There's plenty of space. They can all spread out. They can all get a bucket or something to put their weeds into or be sharing that. I have tools, hand tools for all of them to be using, and we can all go to work. But if we're watering, I don't have the whole class watering at the same time. If we're using larger tools, I don't have them all doing that at the same time. So trying to like figure out when they're using small tools in a big space, you can have more kids working on it. If you're working with larger tools in a smaller space, then you really do want to divide them up into more groups and have more jobs for that class to actually do. I tend to rotate my kids because they all want to know if they're going to switch so that they can do more than one job. So we tend to rotate. I have a megaphone, which I used to have like a little flute, and I would blow the flute. And I say this, I know that we're talking about student safety and engagement, but like that cue, those of you in classrooms who have the little like responsive classroom bell or that sound cue is really important to them. My flute went by the wayside when we started wearing masks. So then I got the megaphone, which like, it's not quite as lovely, but it definitely does the job in terms of getting everyone's attention and getting them to move to another space and letting them know, like, you know, diggers, leave your shovels where they are and you're moving to the watering station. Waters, you're going to go weed, and then weeders are going to the digging station. So I'm kind of moving them around.
How large of a space are you gardening?
It depends. Some of my gardens are bigger than others. I do tend to expand outside of the space that's originally given to me as much as I possibly can. So I have one garden that's like a 20 by 40 inch fenced in space, but we have apple trees outside and picnic tables outside, and the compost bins are outside. And so everybody's not inside the garden at the same time. It is with all of the beds, and there are 12 beds in there, and some herb gardens and rhubarb and raspberries. It's like, it's pretty tight. So I can bring a group of 23 into that space, but I can't really have them all working in that space. Right?
Gotcha. So it's more than just a hey kids, listen up. It's more than that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's why like the megaphone comes in handy, because once you set them to work, and we're going to come back to kind of setting it up for success, but once you set them to work, it's hard to pull them back to you and get their attention. So that's why having some sort of sound, bell, chime, triangle, you know, you decide what works for you, but having a way to get their attention effectively, especially if you start to see unsafe behavior. Right. So I've got them like out in their stations, and they're all working with different tools. So I don't know if the notes and the links to some of those tools, Dinah, are going to wind up in the notes from this presentation, but we use utility shovels, which are these little shovels that most people like throw in the back of their truck if they get like stuck somewhere in the sand. But they're little like D-handled, like, you know, right, they're just a miniaturized version of your basic garden shovel, and those are really excellent. I use them with all of my students pre-K through 6th grade. The 6th graders are like, yeah, they're so small, but whatever, they're fine, like they can totally fit, and use those. And those just, they add an element of safety because you don't have like the long handle of the shovel tipping back and then some kid turning and like whacking somebody in the elbow with like the long handle of the shovel. They're just more compact. So the smaller the tool, the safer it generally is. I always say to my kids, like, we remind them, they've been hearing this from me forever, but the metal part of the tool, like I hold up the tool and I'm like, what is this part made out of? And they're like, metal. The metal part of your tool stays below your waist. Put your hands on your waist, and they'll put their hands on their waist. And that's just like a regular reminder. Like when I'm handing out shovels, it's like something that I'm always saying is that the metal part stays below your waist. And I also remind them that if they can't remember that, then I will give them a smaller tool and they can use the small tool because they can't use the big tool. So the size of the tool really does matter. I really try not to give kids like full-size tools. Sometimes like 5th and 6th grades will get full-size tools. I also, we're growing fruits and vegetables out there. We do eat them. So, we'll slice up carrots in the garden. We'll slice up cucumbers in the garden. We might chop up an apple in the garden. So there are a number of different tools that I use for that too. There are like lettuce knives that are out there now. They're plastic. They have a kind of a wavy edge to them, and they're big. They're like the size of a full-size butcher knife, but they're made out of plastic, and they're really just meant for cutting like lettuce or cucumbers or something that's like super soft and crunchy. I also use these wavy knives. You can Google wavy knives. They generally come up as like a Montessori tool, but they're essentially like just a plastic handle and a wide angled blade with like a wave to it, so you can make those like fancy looking carrots. But they're more blunt than like a sharpened real kitchen knife. And so those are like tools that work for kids, but aren't necessarily dangerous with kids. I've also, I mean, we don't do a lot of cooking in the garden, so I don't need to give them, you know, really sharp knives to cut a lot of different things. We're not doing knife skills out there, but I have heard people, you know, who do that say that the sharper the knife, the safer the knife. So, and I really, I like the knives that come with like a little plastic cover on the top of them. So if you're doing any preparation of any of the food, you're using those kinds of tools. So we've like, you know, we're using tools that kind of fit the job. We're keeping the metal part below our waist. I certainly use hand cultivators. I use trowels a lot. I have, you know, soft kid size leaf rakes. We're doing a lot of spring cleaning right now. So it's all about kind of sizing it. But then, you know, what are we actually planting and what are they actually doing? So there are a couple of different ways that I structure my classes so that the kids are really bought into what we're doing. One of which is that they generally will decide as a group what they want to plant. So I'll give them a theme, like in first grade when we're learning about different plant parts. I'll say, okay, what root do we want to plant? What stem do we want to plant? What, you know, but they get to choose. They get to decide if they want to grow carrots or radishes, or if they want to grow lettuce or spinach, or, you know, so that there's choice within the framework of the lesson. And as the kids get older, I tend to give them more choice and more like bigger tasks. So my fifth grade is building in the garden. They're building an archway, which is going to be their legacy project, this thing that they leave behind. In the past, they have planted apple trees. Other classes have built little frog ponds. They have built new garden beds. They've done mural painting, and the class as a whole decides what they want that project to be, and then they get into it. And in that way, it's like if they start to check out, I'm like, but you decided that you wanted to do this, so like you got to finish it. You got to like follow through. So that's one of the ways that I kind of structure lessons for student buy-in. And when I pass it to Eliza, we can talk more about that.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, so this early on in sort of the RUC's history, we had a lot of gardens that were built because there was like a lot of excitement. We had this new program in the city, and a lot of teachers reached out to us, and there weren't really good systems to keep them surviving long. So, you know, maybe there was a teacher that year that signed up for a garden, and it was really exciting at first, and then 3 years later, that teacher left, and the garden sat vacant at the school until 10 years later, you know, when they finally reach out to us again, or whatever it be. So we've kind of built systems over the years, sort of backtracking, being like, well, we built all these gardens in the city, but we didn't have good systems for maintaining them. How do we go back and make sure that students and educators are engaged, and that schools, and that they're sustainable, and that they can, like, you know, be good learning tools? So one thing that we have done, and we would give a lot of annual vegetables like tomatoes, peppers, eggplant, things that were really summer heavy, and the students would plant them in the spring, and then they'd grow all summer, and they weren't really there for that process, and they'd come back and maybe they'd still be there in the fall. But that was the nature of sort of the gardens. And so so we have that conversation with students about, you know, what grows when, and what varieties of things do you want to see grown, and like, what do you eat at home? What are your favorite foods? What are the dishes that you make at home? And what kinds of things can grow in this climate here? So we do the same thing. We make a big list, and then we plant them, and we try to incorporate a lot of like perennial crops and herbs and things that come back every year, similar to how Hope does it. And also like some early starts and some late growers. So things that they're going to see before they get out of school, and things that they'll see again when they come back to school in the fall. Because we live in New England, and the main garden season is also a time that students are not at school. Another thing we do is we to try to like make it easier for educators, because we know that educators are really like really busy, and we don't want it to feel like the garden is this really hard extra thing that they're adding to their plate, but that we're sort of there as a resource to help them in their classrooms and get the kids outside. So we give something in the fall. We make a sort of a welcome packet, and it has tasks broken down by months. So saying, you know, in September you can do this, in October you can do this, in November you can do this, and these are the things we can come to help you with, and just kind of giving them ideas so they don't feel like they're starting from scratch. So we and also like that they coincide with the curriculum. So we give them this sort of like a la carte menu per month of things that they can reach out to us if they want us to come run, or we say, you know, you can do this on your own. If you need seeds, here's seeds, but also I am willing to just come and run this for you to take some stuff off your plate. We also, as I said, like, you know, teacher turnover is big, especially, you know, in urban schools. So we, to sort of avoid a project residing with one teacher who might leave in a couple of years, we try to get really engaged like a whole school. So either that's, you know, multiple educators. We always get a principal to sign on. The principal can communicate with the maintenance staff if we have like a big soil delivery or a lumber delivery or whatever it may be. Making friends with the custodians is huge. They're not going to be happy if a pile of soil shows up and they didn't know about it. So making sure that there's different parties involved. And so we often have like the main educator liaison who sort of acts as our point of contact, but we try to engage more than one and more than one department where we can. And we also work with a lot of wraparound coordinators who tend to be really good at filling in those gaps. They work a lot with the, you know, English language learners or special education or life skills classes, summer school, like after school programs. They know what's going on in the school, and they have been amazing resources at sort of figuring out which groups can fit into the garden when and bringing them out there. So let's see. Yeah, in school versus after school. So we have a lot of success with younger grades, just because, you know, the nature of schooling is they have less testing and they're already learning about photosynthesis and weather and climate. And so we tend to have success doing in classroom workshops with the kids in the younger grades, but we do a lot of after school programming with the middle and high schoolers. So we run internships and clubs, and we have some small grant funding for paid positions for teens. So we also run a youth employment program at our farm at the REC. We have a farm out back, and those teams sort of help train other teams around the city to work at their high school gardens. And that's been really amazing. So just sort of that if it feels hard to engage, you know, kids in high school because of the time constraint, starting a club or doing something like that after school has been really successful. We also just are trying to branch out to engage different departments. Like we tend to think of science when we think about a school garden, and lots of our teacher liaisons are science teachers. So yeah, we work with art teachers to put murals on the beds, or, you know, to label the plants and make really fun signs, or you know, welcome to our garden signs, or even just like, yeah, literacy classes outdoors, just kind of using the garden as a space. So we just encourage it to be used in different departments throughout the school. You know, sensory gardens are really great for some of the special ed classrooms. We have them, you know, touch and taste and smell. And also we do some family history stuff about, you know, where your family's from. Is there a culinary dish from that place? Can you interview family members about important foods? And can we make it a point to grow those foods in the garden? That's been really successful, especially in a city like Worcester, in a really diverse place where, you know, we know what tomatoes and peppers are, but if a kid can see a vegetable that they don't usually get in school, they're really excited. And we've had a lot of parents kind of reach out to us. You know, they saw okra in the bed and they were really excited, and kind of moves to the next piece of volunteering. But that's been really great. So just think outside the box on engaging different departments. We were able to partner with this woman who runs a Japanese weaving studio and get an arts-based grant for her to come run a 6-week program at one of our high schools. So we grew indigo and marigolds and black dye sunflowers and onions and different things that we could dye stuff with. And she ran this program called Seed to Fashion. And the point of that was to say, okay, maybe you're not into food, maybe you don't feel like cooking, you don't really want to learn about vegetables, but do you like fashion? Do you like clothes? Like the garden can be a resource for that too. And so we grew all the plants, and then we did many dyeing sessions, and then the kids were able to weave a scarf out of that and take it home. And we also used old t-shirts that were dyed with plants to sort of like weave them into the fence that was surrounding it. And it's made it this really attractive, bright, nice space where I think people want to be. And it does just on its own now attract like other teachers in the school who are like, oh, that's kind of pretty. I want to take my kids outside. So just making it a nice space to be too. And Hope, I'll pass it to you.
All right. So I touched on this a little bit, but structuring the lesson is really important. So we arrive into the garden, and there has to be like a space, right? Students come into a classroom and they know where to go, right? They go to their cubbies, they put their folders away, they sit down at their desk, they start their morning work. They're, students in school are used to a routine of arrival, right? They arrive into the art room, they arrive into the cafeteria, and they know like where to go and what to do. And so in the garden, we have benches or picnic tables or whatever it might be. And that's kind of our outdoor classroom. So we're coming into that space in order to get started. So where you start your lesson really matters. Students need to know where to stand, how to stand. Are there pathways? We use a lot of raised beds in the gardens that I work in. And so keeping kids off of the edge of the bed, that's not where we're gathering. We're not standing on there, that we're gathering in the bench, or we're gathering around the garden, our feet are on the wood chips. Like that is really important about where we start. Most of my lessons are about 40 minutes. I have 40-minute blocks with everyone. So the way that I divide that time is I tend to do about a 10-minute intro, which I would consider kind of like a mini lesson. So if we're talking about plant parts, we're going to run through, root, stems, leaves, flowers, fruits, and seeds, and what, all of these things are, what they do for the plant, what fruits we eat, what stems we eat, and kind of go through a little mini lesson on those plant parts. And then we're going to get out on a day like today, and we're going to get the garden ready to actually plant those parts. On a day later in the season, it might be that we're, going to be looking at these seeds, and then we're going to be putting them in the ground to like actually grow our bean plant or whatever it might be. So, but we start with about a 10-minute mini lesson. And then I was talking about the station rotation. So then I have about 30 minutes left, right? So I'm taking about 7 to 8 minutes per station. So they're rotating through on, it's fairly quick that they're moving through those stations, which tends to work for the attention span. They've done probably 2 or 3 watering cans by the time it's time to switch from the watering team to the digging team, or from the digging team to the wood chip moving team, or from the spring leaf cleanup team to the planting team. And so part of the structure around that is like, I have like me and the teacher out there in the garden. So I don't have somebody with every team all the time. Generally, if there's a planting thing going on, then I'm with the planters. But otherwise, we're kind of floating around, but figuring out like which activities are you doing in that day that need direct adult supervision, and which activities can kids kind of do on their own, right? So part of that has to do with what tools you're giving them. Part of that has to do with where they might be working. Ideally, all of the garden is like within line of sight, but if not, if you might need to be over at the compost bin because it's around the backside of the shed, and the teacher might need to be in the garden. So just making sure that you're using the grownups in your group to make sure that there's somebody kind of keeping an eye out. on who's doing what where. As I mentioned, I don't bring like a whole group of 23 into the garden and start working if it's just the little like 20 by 40 foot garden. And we're not all doing the same thing. An ideally your groups are no bigger than 8 and better to be closer to 6, but that means you only have 18 kids in your class. So if you're working with a classroom that's closer to 30, then my suggestion would be to actually bring out clipboards and paper and have like, half the class working on like a drawing and observation in the garden activity unattended, and then the other half of the class, right, that group of 15 now split in half into 2 groups of 7 or 8, and one group is watering and the other group is maybe doing some planting. And so that way you can kind of reduce the actual size of the class that you're working with at a time. So figure out what things you can bring in. I mean, and it doesn't have to be just a garden thing. You could, if it's silent reading time, everyone brings their books out, they read for 20 minutes, and then they rotate into the garden and the other group reads for 20 minutes. But just trying to figure out a way in which you can, I mean, different schools have different size gardens, but figuring out a way in which you can create a size that feels safe, because even having the whole class of 25 with like little trowels in their hand can sometimes be a little too much activity with a metal tool. So in fact, so this tool that the kid is using in the slide, we definitely have these in some of the gardens, but I actually prefer their tools, and they're branded with various like popular pop culture characters, but they're plastic and they're super sturdy, and they're really safe, and they're well sized to most of my younger elementary school students. And those are by a company called Midwest Tools. And we have a lot of them in my gardens, and we haven't broken any of them, even though they're plastic. And the metal tools can sometimes bend, even if they don't break. So that just makes it, again, increasing student safety. It's like using those smaller plastic tools. Yeah, so I will pass it back. What's our
Hope, if you send me a list of tools, I can, when I send people the slide deck, I can also add that.
Okay, great. Yeah, I can send links. I mean, they're going to be links to like Home Depot and Lowe's and places like that, but you'll get a sense as to the picture of them, and then you can go out and get them wherever you want to get them.
That's great. I need to get some plastic hand tools. So volunteer coordination. So we run 25 simultaneous school garden programs. And unless the kids and the teachers are going to be out there every day watering and weeding and keeping an eye on the garden, which sometimes is the case and sometimes isn't, we rely heavily on volunteers, because that's a lot of gardening that needs to get done and a lot of tasks that need to be done. So we asked pretty early on in the spring sort of what a school's capacity is that year. And we understand that can change year to year. So during the pandemic, it looked a lot different than it did, prior to the pandemic, and it looks a lot more. It looks a lot different now. So we were able, sort of during the pandemic, we thought, okay, well, all these schools aren't in session. No one's at the schools, but all these people are interested in gardening that were never interested in gardening before. So what can we do to sort of close that gap? And so people would reach out to us and ask if there are extra spaces in community gardens, because we also run a community gardens program, and there wasn't. And so we'd said, we'd reach out to the schools and we'd say, hey, no one's at school for the year. Can a neighbor take the school garden? And we'd sort of look around the city and see, okay, where does this person live? What's the closest school? And we were like, why haven't we done this before? We should just have always done this during the summer, during the summers. And it was kind of like an aha moment for us. So we ask what a school's capacity is. So we give them 3 options. We say, low capacity. So your school has limited ability to maintain the garden over the summer, which is totally fair. So we'll choose a package for you that will be some spring things and some fall things and some long season crops. And we'll make sure that people are available to water it, but no one really needs to harvest. And the bulk of what's growing is not going to be summer heavy. And we'll try to harvest as much as we can before the summer. High capacity is, your school is able to be there during the summer. So maybe you have your own group of volunteers or like a really dedicated maintenance staff or teacher that just wants to be there over the summer. You have a summer school program or a PTO member who really wants to like use the garden. And in exchange, watering and weeding, and they can take the produce and figure out what to do with the produce. Or you just want to take a year off from the garden because it feels too much, and you can't maintain the garden this year, but you'd like us to recruit and train some volunteer support to maintain the garden for you. And if that's the case, they will either take that home themselves, or we'll have a volunteer harvest it for the community fridges, which I'll kind of explain in a moment. But some schools, have regulations around who and who can't be on campus. So some schools don't want volunteers. Some schools' gardens are located in a courtyard, so volunteers can actually even get into the school to get the garden. I don't know. There are many reasons, but we also have a lot of members in our community that want to grow but don't have the space to do so. So we try really hard to connect every school that will sort of lay empty over a summer with a volunteer, and just let the volunteer know that like until school's out for the summer, the kids are going to be in the garden. And then as soon as the kids get back, I don't know what it's going to look like, if people are going to continue to take the produce, but these gardens are open resources. So don't be disappointed if your tomatoes get stolen, but also you can take what's there and help out. We can move to the next slide. Yeah, so during the pandemic, we saw the emergence of a community fridge network in Worcester, which was a super game changer for school gardens, because previously we had all this produce that was beautiful in the summer and not enough volunteers to pick it, or not enough neighbors that even knew the garden was there. And so we were always trying to like take our youth groups to go harvest as much as possible and have people take it home, but pantries didn't want it, or there was no system at the school to give it out to the students there. Then we saw these free fridges pop up, and the key tenets are that they're open, they're free 24/7. They reduce the barriers to food access, even the barriers that pantries have, which could be limited hours, or you need proof of residency or an ID card. And they're community filled and community cleaned and community accessed. And it opened up some really amazing conversations in our summer programs about food insecurity, and with our teens and with our students about how they can help kind of give back to community members who are struggling. And one of the key sort of like tenets of the fridges are that people can take what they need when they need it and however much they want. And we assume that if people are taking the food, they must need it, and that we're not going to judge them for it. We're not going to ask questions. And if you fill the fridge and an hour later it's gone, like someone needed that. So that's sort of like a good lesson, I guess, to incorporate with the students, is that we're not judging anyone who needs to use these and how much they need. And it was so successful. The youth took so much ownership over it. They like labeled every little eggplant that they harvested, like this was grown at the North High School garden. And there was 4 fridges during the summer. There might only be 3 now. But it's a great way to talk about the gardens as a big community resource beyond just the schools that they serve, and sort of connect that piece. And the only thing, and I would say it's opened up a lot of conversations about at the schools themselves, like, can we start, some of our schools are like, we should have a free fridge for parents at pickup, and some of our schools with gardens are like, we should just have a fridge here and we can bring all the produce into the fridge and people can take it as they come and go. And it's a nationwide movement, this kind of free fridge thing. It's not unique to Worcester. It's started many years ago, but I think during the pandemic, when there was a lot more food insecurity, they sprung up in even more places. So you do need to have a source of electricity. So if you're thinking of like starting something like this, a business has to sign on to it, or a school or someone's home, but they're usually publicly available on the sidewalk or in a lot or something like that. So, but there's a lot of information about free fridges and community fridges, and there's a link even in this slide that'll get sent out. So, yeah.
All right, so we talked about some of the tools and all of the other materials that you'd actually need for your garden. I was going to talk about some of the funding that I use for my programs. They're all kind of funded differently. I've been doing this work for a long time, and I've done work with after school and in-school programs, and there have been just a tremendous number of like different pieces of funding that have come together to actually make these programs happen. I will also say that there tends to be like an evolution of funding for these programs, depending on how long they are sustained in your district, where you generally start out with smaller, grant-based, slightly less reliable forms of funding, and ideally move towards a school-based funding model, where it actually becomes part of the school budget, which doesn't necessarily mean that it's like reliable, because school budgets get cut. But the garden program, if there's enough community support for it, tends to not be one of those things. And it might like come up on the chopping block, but like there's, you know, such an uproar about the idea of it actually being cut that it sticks around. They tend to find the funding for it once it becomes school-based. It also depends on who your allies are in the district, kind of like what Eliza was saying about working with a whole school. You know, if you have a variety of teachers in different departments and principals and custodians all on board, then those people are also your allies when it comes to supporting you for funding, and really advocating for the value of the program. So there's a million different grants out there. There's the Whole Kids Foundation through Whole Foods. There's Mass Ag in the Classroom. There are USDA, you know, farm to school grants, implementation grants. You know, a lot of these can be really big. Some of them can be very, very small. Kids Gardening has a grant program. They partner. They're a great resource for finding funding sources. They list a lot of different funding sources, especially when it comes to stuff. Like if you're looking for materials, if you're looking to buy things, whether it's a greenhouse or a shovel or soil or seeds, that's a great place to look if you're trying to get that stuff. Funding humans, right? Funding people to actually work in the garden is a little bit trickier and tends to have to go through more of a foundation grant, like a local foundation grant. So either PTO funding, if you have a local foundation, like here in Western Mass, most of the towns have their own education foundation, and a lot of towns across the Commonwealth have that. So you could always go to your local town and see if there's actually a local foundation, like a foundation. The banks can sometimes get on board with funding these types of programs. Yeah, but again, eventually trying to move it towards the school taking ownership of it. And that process requires those allies to come on board, because it's hard to be one person and try and advocate for why this should be a sustainably funded program. The town that I live in has an extensive garden that receives no funding from the town. It's all through either the Education Foundation or just volunteer hours. And it's not nearly as robust a program as some of the towns that I work in, where they are actually funded through the district. So it's kind of a goal to try and get it to be more of an embedded program. It also helps in terms of the sustainability of the program, like actually having it be something that isn't tied to just one teacher, but is tied to, like, this is just something that our school does. Like, we have school gardens. Every third grade class does this. Every second grade class does this. And it's just part of how we do in this town. The after school programs are some of the earliest ways that I started getting involved in this. So I built gardens at a number of schools in Holyoke and Springfield as part of the 21st Century After School program. So that program is funded, through federal grant money that comes through the state. So if you're interested in building a garden, or you're looking to maintain a garden that you're using during the school day, if you can engage that your after school program to maybe have a garden club or something like that, then they can help with the maintenance of it. And that doesn't, there's no fundraising that needs to go on for that. This time of year, it's also good to think about seed sales and plant sales. A lot of plant sales are for benefit and, to somebody. So if you have a local like plant enthusiast group, and you could partner with them to see if they would sponsor the garden with this year's plant sale. That's another idea. Fedco Seeds does a school seed sale where you can order seeds in bulk and you can put them in little packages, and then they'll sell the seeds to you at a discount, and you can sell them at full price and then make the difference. Essentially, you make 50% off of it. So there's a lot of different ways to do it, some more time consuming than others. I would say it all kind of starts out as a bit of a patchwork. I should also mention Mass Ag in the Classroom. A lot of people have gotten mini grants through them, and they're a great way to like kickstart if you're looking for, to build some garden beds or get a yard of soil or whatever it is. But they're relatively small, so they're good at getting a few things, and then but again, not so much for staffing. So I'll pause there with that.
Yeah, this is I feel like this is sort of piggybacking off of the volunteer stuff, but yeah, so we have as part of the network, sort of every school can get free seedlings, and we have a city coordinated delivery of compost that we've had a partnership with the city of Worcester, and they deliver compost for free to all of our sites, which is an invaluable resource for us and our gardens. But our youth growers, our teen employment program, they actually grow in different college greenhouses throughout the city. They grow all the seedlings as part of like their leadership development for the school and community gardens. So it's kind of this cool, we're branching the programs, and the 40 teens in our summer program are helping out all the school and community gardens, and that's really great. And so that's a resource that we've been able to offer because of some various grant funding that we've been able to offer our school gardens. So we have a lot going on in the spring where we do big compost delivery days and fill days, and often those aren't times that necessarily align with the classroom, but the work still has to, the beds still need filling, and usually the plants, we coordinate that with a classroom, and we plant the plants with them. But for days that we have, for instance, like we have to rebuild the beds because they're really old. We do all raised bed gardening because we work in a industrial city, and the soils are not great, and we don't have years to remediate them. So we're often just doing raised beds, and it feels like an approachable thing, I think, for schools and teachers to have like a couple of raised beds, and then we're always looking to expand. But that's kind of how we work is raised beds. So when the beds get old, or we feel like we need to build new beds or expand the garden, we usually have big community work days. So we use Sign Up Genius, parent volunteers. We promote it to the school. If it's a high school, we invite like whatever after school club or environmental club, or clubs that need kids that need volunteer hours to come help us, because they're 16 and older. They can use power tools and help us with the drills. We also have a lot of parent volunteers or neighbors step up in exchange for free produce, as I said before. So we have started to do like mini farmers market events at schools, where we also, so the REC also has a farmers market. So we have 3 main programs: Youth Grow, our teen employment program; You Grow, which is school and community gardens; and farmers markets. So we've been doing this partnership with our farmers market, where we'll come to the school and we'll do a mini farmers market for a classroom or a whole grade. And in the bags that they take home, we put information about the school garden to say, like, did you know your child goes to a school where there's a school garden? Email me if you have any questions or you want to get involved. And so we've had a lot of people just step up to say like, oh, I didn't know this, but I'd like to be involved somehow. So if there's any sort of information just going out with families anyway, sending that out, and wraparound coordinators again are a great resource for sending out information to parents. So there's that. Summer school programs, as I said. There are sometimes some union regulations where teachers cannot, we've run into this, where teachers cannot help out in the gardens over the summer, like with the principal knowing, because they can't work during the summer, you know, any more than the union says they could, and that makes sense. But we've had some teachers get in trouble for just like, they're like, we just like being in the garden over the summer, and we live next door and we want to help out, but they like get in trouble for being there. So just to keep in mind. We also tap into city and state funding for youth jobs. So we have groups of our teens go to the different gardens and help out with the work days in the spring and help clean the gardens in the fall. We have a lot of corporate group volunteer days, and like sports teams, like rugby teams and hockey teams that reach out for volunteer days, and we'll use that to be like, okay, we're building 10 raised beds at this school and we need like a big volunteer day. So there's lots of like strange, I wouldn't have thought of it, but they're looking for volunteer hours. You know, organizations like Blue Cross Blue Shield, there's some other ones that are pretty consistent and need, like, they have volunteer days. Another thing is college students. We have a lot of college students in Worcester, and so we post for a lot of internships, and we just you know, we have for instance, like a lot of our gardens have fruit trees, so we'll train them and we'll be, okay, you're going to be our you know, our intern for the season, and we're going to prune all the fruit trees in the network. Or you know, your job is to harvest from these 3 schools in your quadrant of the city and bring them to the free fridges. And then we find that the most successful gardens are the gardens that have like a 3-legged approach, we call it. So it's the school, it's the REC who's running the garden programming, and then some sort of third party. So that could be like a close organization that's next door that can keep an eye on the garden, or a neighbor, or a dedicated volunteer or family member. And this like collaboration of someone in the school, someone from the REC, and like a third party has been like the most successful for our gardens. There's like always someone who's keeping an eye on the garden. There's like always new ideas generated. That's kind of like we hope that every garden has all 3 of those.
I'm going to stop sharing my screen. That was such a wealth of information, and everyone here will be sending the slide deck out. But we have a few minutes for questions. Thank you. I mean, Eliza and Hope, your experience is between the 2 of you. Like, you could pretty much answer anything. So if anyone has questions, please take this time to ask. You can drop it in the chat, or just use your mic. Yeah,
I'm also curious where everyone is from. Like, are people?
Yeah, I didn't start. I should have done that to start. I'm sorry, I didn't, Eliza. I'm curious to know, are people here? Are they teachers? Where are they from? Are they garden coordinators? Are they volunteers? So if you had a minute and you can get to the chat, if you could just throw in the chat, what brings you here to this webinar, and what are your biggest interests? Thank you, Shelley. So food service director in Plainville.
We actually work with a food service director who's just a community gardener, and you know, Ellen Nyland, she's just a community gardener in our network, but she's like a rock star food service director, and I'm just hoping that that's like one, we haven't crossed that bridge yet. We don't have any connections with food service directors, and we don't do a lot with like school food, and that's one thing I'd like to do. So I'm glad you're here.
Shelley and Lisa, I assume you're Shelley's assistant. We just, Mass Farm to School just created a school garden food safety tool. And so you might be interested in looking at that. It is on our website, but it's basically it's a self audit where you would work with your school garden to look at making sure the garden food safety is being handled in such a way that it will support health. So as
Can
you're
I-
looking to incorporate the garden into your menu.
I'm sorry, can I just tell you about me rather than trying to write out the chart?
Absolutely. We would love that.
Hi, my name is Peter Giovanni. I'm the science teacher for the Grow School out in Dudley, Mass. And I've taken over the garden responsibility since I've moved in there. I'm also the farm to school coordinator for the Webster district, working for and with Ellen Nyland. I've had a very close association with the REC back when I was with the UInc Yetta School. So I'm very familiar with what they offer and the Orient Street Gardens and just such a wonderful organization to work with. And I can't tell you how much I've gained from just these conversations that have been going on. If it didn't answer my questions, it certainly gave me more questions that I need to answer. Let's put it that way. I'm at the middle school, which is an entirely different set of issues when you talk about bringing kids into a school garden. It truly is the herding cats. That's why I was kind of curious around, should I use a bullhorn? Should I use a dinner bell? Should I use a whistle? Just to get the young men, young women's attention. And I'm still undecided what's going to work best. But
Peter, we're going to start in the fall. It was requested that Mass Farm to School host like a garden coordinator affinity group, like a collection, and we're going to host monthly meetings. So I will put you on. Are you on our mailing list?
If I'm not, please put me on.
I'll put you on, and I will let you know of that. But it'll be a monthly meeting with whatever garden coordinators. Hopefully, Eliza and Hope will want to be there. There's some others who want to just go and talk and share and
Absolutely.
trade secrets of bullhorns.
I mean, I know a lot, but as far as the organizing goes, I'm still kind of getting my feet wet, if you will. I've had a lot of experience around the schools, the UInc facilities and what have you, but it's like, it's just a little bit different out here at the Grow School and the Webster middle and elementary schools. So that'll be interesting because we just established beds at the middle school. We're still waiting for the okay to establish them at the elementary school. So this is the germination. We got a nice USDA grant, and this year is our planning year, but we're much farther ahead than just planning. We're also in the throes of implementing what we had already planned to do. So it's kind of like a little bit ahead of the curve, but nevertheless, it's still within its own, germination period.
Thank you. There is a question, Hope and Eliza, in the chat, which is, what is a good timeline to start this? This would be for the next school year.
Might defer. Well, Eliza's got that timelines for fall, but I mean, it really depends on what you want to do. So Shelley, you're talking about working it into food service. So that would mean like growing stuff that you could actually harvest and use in food service. So the question is really like, what can you use in food service? Like if the garden, like if you're just talking about like bare ground, and what the timeline would be, I mean, I would start as soon as possible to put in your raised beds or till the ground or whatever it might be. But if you already have like a garden, then to figure out like what you would use. So like, would you use butternut squash? Would you use potatoes? Would you use carrots? What kinds of crops would be best in the kitchen, and then figure out which teachers you might be able to engage with and say, I'm really interested in growing a crop of carrots for the fall for the cafeteria. Like, would you be willing to help plant them? And then, get a group of kids out there and plant a bunch of carrots and, get some volunteers involved in keeping them watered over the summer and then harvest them and then pull them in and do like a whole, figure out how you're going to use them. And I mean, I think that the engagement, the empowerment amongst the kids who actually do that would be really rewarding. And I think it could be a great kickstart to a more robust program that was really centered around food service. a lot of school gardens are centered around academics, right? Providing a hands-on kind of learning lab outside for a lot of the content kids are learning inside. But if you're the catalyst as the food service director for the program, then centering it around food service and seeing it more as like almost like a community service, like kids are getting the chance to learn how to plant food and then they get to serve it and maybe get up and do a little public speaking and be like, we planted these back in May and this is what it looked like. And then they grew and we watered and here's a little like photo album of the growth process. And I mean, you could take it all sorts of places, but depending on where you're at, if you don't have a garden, I would start building. And if you do have a garden, starting in May with planting and picking something that's going to be around in the fall.
Yeah, we do, like, I feel like most schools reach out to us like as soon as it gets warm in the spring. And as soon as people are starting to think about gardening and they're like, oh my gosh, we want to garden this year. And that can be hard to sort of fit it into our spring schedule of all the schools that are like, oh, we need a new garden. But when schools reach out in the fall, we have this whole winter period of being able to plan with the kids. So being able to say, what do you want from this garden, and draw your dream garden, and what are things we can grow. And I like using that like dormant period for planning and scheming, but that can also happen in early spring. So I think, yeah, piggybacking on Hope, just like as soon as possible.
Shelley, I'm going to also send you some information about our Mass Farm to School Institute, because if you wanted to create a team at your school with a science teacher and an administrator, you could, and you wanted to create a project, it might be an interesting thing to come be a part of the Institute, to apply to the Institute, and then you would get paired with a coach who could kind of help you roll that out in your first year and just get more support. So I'll send you that information like after this workshop.
Yeah, and I want to say too that we talked about the Farm to School conference that was happening, and we're a field trip site. So if people are in Central Mass or want to come, that's part of that the conference. We're doing a tour of our youth farm, and then driving to a tour of one of our really successful school gardens, the one where we did the Seed to Fashion program and like have the murals and stuff like that. So if anyone's curious and wants to stop by, we'll be doing a field trip that day, May 21st, but you can get more info for signing up for the conference.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Hope and Eliza. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise. And some people have already dropped off the call. So I'll be sending a follow-up with the slide deck, and Hope, if you want to send me a tool list, I can add that to the email. And Shelley, I'll send you the information, and Lisa as well. So thanks so much.
Bye.